Hopefully you got a W in week 7 as we go into week 8 of the fantasy football season. I'm bringing you must start and sit wide receivers going into this week, and hopefully you got the W. And if not, you still plenty of time to get yourself into the playoff race. This week, no bye weeks. Thank God. We went from bye apocalypse to not one team having a bye week going into week 8. So hopefully that really helps your team this week. 32 teams, 16 matchups, over 60 wide receivers I'm going to be talking about today. So let's not waste any more time. Starting off with Thursday night matchup, Buccaneers at the Buffalo Bills, an upsetting loss that the Bills face against New England Patriots here. Over under is 41.5. The Bills are favored, and I think you have to say the Bills are going to bounce back at some point in time here. Starting at the Bucs side of the ball, Mike Evans is somebody that you're going to continue to start. Wide receiver 16 after this bye week. Caught 6 out of 8 targets and a touchdown, over 20 fantasy points. He is still that guy. Someone I truly believe can finish as a top 12 wide receiver coming into this week, because Baker Mayfield has been kind of cooking it so far. Chris Godwin, his teammate, caught 6 out of 12 targets, only 12 fantasy points. He has been a mid wide receiver. I would say a really good solid flex wide receiver if you have him on your team. Unfortunately, maybe you draft him in the 4th round. I'm not necessarily sure where you drafted him, but right now I do believe he is a must start depending on your team, but at the flex position. So if you have any questions about Chris Godwin and any start-sit questions regarding him specifically, put it down below as well. Going to the Bills side of the ball, Stephon Diggs, wide receiver 2, over 17 fantasy points, 12 targets and a touchdown this past week against New England Patriots. And his teammate Gabe Davis, I have him as a start, somebody that you can plug and play depending on maybe you have injuries, maybe you need a high upside play. Granted, he only caught 1 out of 5 targets this past week against the New England Patriots. You have to think that there is going to be a better bounce back game for him coming into this week, especially going back to Buffalo. So if you need a boom play, just know that he can have a bust week as well. So keep that in mind. Stephon Diggs and Gabe Davis are 2 guys that you're going to have to be monitoring going into this week. Keep in mind, the Tampa Bay Buccaneers do give up the 12th most fantasy points to the wide receiver position. So if they want to bounce back, need some big plays early and often, this could be a good play if you need Gabe Davis as a boom week. All right, going to our first 1 p.m. slate games. Texans at the Panthers, 42.5. The Texans are favored. Both of these teams coming off a bye week, getting healthier, so anything can happen, especially this week. Starting at the Texans side of the ball, I do believe there is really only one must-start wide receiver coming into this week, and that is Nico Collins, wide receiver 15 on the year. And look, he's only had 2 games under 10 fantasy points. That was in week 3 against Jacksonville and week 5 against the Atlanta Falcons. The rest has been over 12 fantasy points, which has been really exciting. CJ Stroud is clearly the truth. He's going to continue to target one of his favorite wide receivers on this team, and Nico Collins. And the Panthers, even though they do not give up a lot of points to the wide receiver position, you have to expect this game to be a high scoring game in reality, because how good the Texans have been in scoring points, and how, Bryce Young and this Panthers team have been putting up points, not in the first half of the first period. So maybe week 3, week 4, week 5, week 6, they've been putting up points before their bye week. So definitely start Nico Collins as the week continues or comes in. Going to his teammate, Tank Adele. He is a spot start. He is somebody that I have on multiple teams. I'm going to be dealing with who should I be starting and sitting. I have to deal with Tank Dell, Jahan Dotson, Garrett Wilson. I have to deal with a lot of different people, different players. Just all depends on who's on your team, right? I do believe he could be a good start depending on who's there. So once again, comment down below. Let us know who you are struggling to start, Tank Dell versus whichever wide receiver, and I can 100% easily answer that question if you put it down below. Going to the Panthers side of the ball, the really only person that I'm comfortable starting is the wide receiver 7 on this team, or on the season so far throughout 8 weeks, and that is Adam Thielen. I mean, listen to this. Against Miami this past week, 11 out of 13 targets, 115 yards and a touchdown, over 28 fantasy points. We have been getting so many questions, so many trade questions saying, hey, should I trade Adam Thielen away for, a top wide receiver? And it's so hard to say, yes, just trade him. Like big name wide receivers. You think, okay, Adam Thielen or Chris Olave, Adam Thielen or Jalen Waddle, and you're in your mind, you're like, yeah, of course I want those guys. They're clearly more talented. They're younger. You know, they're going to get so much, they're going to get better. But Adam Thielen has been consistent throughout the year outside of week 1. Weeks 2 to 6, he has been the wide receiver 3 on the season so far. Obviously, things that might have changed due to the bye week, but he has been incredible. I don't see how that can change and why that's going to change, because no one else on his team I'm willing to start or is going to be stepping up. This is where you can see the bye week in I guess push in production when it comes down to these young wide receivers like a Jonathan Mingo, like a Terrace Marshall, who by the way has been rumored on the trade block. So we'll wait and see what that looks like. Maybe they even bring in somebody like a Jerry Jeudy or some other type of wide receiver, but we'll have to wait and see. Adam Thielen is the only wide receiver I'm starting on the Carolina Panthers. All right, let's go into our next matchup here. Rams at the Cowboys, over under 45.5. The Cowboys are favorite. Cowboys coming off their bye week, so they're getting healthy both on offense and on defense. Starting the Rams side of the ball, I think you start both of these guys. You start Puka Nacua and Cooper Kupp. And let's start off with Cooper Kupp, because I know a lot of people were saying, well, he didn't have his best game, caught only 2 out of 7 targets on the 7 fantasy points against Pittsburgh. But you have to understand that, you know, he's going to be better. We've seen week 1, right when he comes back against Philly, 12 targets. He's going to get the opportunity. It's not like he didn't even get the target. He's got 7 targets, right? He just couldn't connect. It was a little bit difficult in this game. I don't think the, you know, football gods were on their side against for the Los Angeles Rams coming into this week. So you have to keep that in mind as well. Puka Nacua obviously did his thing, over 23 fantasy points, 12 targets, over 154 yards. You start him with confidence. Now, a lot of people, I do believe, are going to say, what about Tutu Atwell? He did find the end zone, but you have to look at the context. Only caught 1 out of 2 targets. He did play 74% of snap share. Not someone I am willing to start coming into this week, so keep that in mind. Now going to the Dallas Cowboys side of the ball, you start CeeDee Lamb with confidence. This past week, called 7 out of 7, over 117 yards. You know, and look, the Rams are pretty good against the pass. They currently give up, if quick maths, it is the 4th fewest points to the wide receiver position. So it's going to be a tough matchup. And the Cowboys as well on the other side of the ball do give up the 2nd least amount of points to the wide receiver position. So both of these teams are going to be struggling, I do believe, in the air, or this could be a shootout the way we all know Matthew Stafford and Dak Prescott can perform. So CeeDee Lamb, you start. Finally, we saw Brandon Cooks before the bye week against Los Angeles Chargers, who currently give up the most fantasy points to the wide receiver position, catching 4 out of 4 targets and a touchdown. Now, it still didn't show me that, okay, Brandon Cooks is going to be part of this offense. It is more of a, you know, okay, he found the end zone. He got 4 targets. It still wasn't his biggest outing. Only played 78% of the snap share, where he's played over 80% in, you know, 1 or 2 games so far this year. Scored 15 fantasy points. I'm not excited to start him coming into this week. I think he could definitely be a, you know, an Uka Dukes. Like, I don't know if you should be starting him into this week. Uka Dukes maybe like he's gonna play you, right? You're gonna start him because, okay, we see him getting the work, but in reality, that's not really the expectation. Week in and week out, I do believe it's more boom bust. That's why I have him as a risky start coming into this week. And I know a lot of people are also gonna ask about Michael Gallup. Caught 3, but he had 10 targets this past week. It's clear that they want to get him the ball. You know, him and Dak Prescott are just not connecting, and I wonder if that's going to improve or be more get cleaned up in the weeks to come. Not somebody I am starting, but someone to keep an eye out on as the weeks go by. So the Rams and the Cowboys should be a really good game going into week 8. All right, our next matchup of this week, Vikings at the Packers. Packers are favored coming into this game, and oddly enough, I do believe that is going to change now that, you know, the Vikings did win against the 49ers, and as the week progresses, I do expect that to change. 43.5 going to, once again, in favor of the Packers. Starting on the Vikings side of the board, Jordan Addison, not really his breakout game, even though he's been consistent throughout the season so far, but having his biggest game so far this year, over 30 fantasy points this past week, over 123 yards, 2 touchdowns, and 10 targets. Jordan Addison sees that workload, and what we've been talking about that he was going to get as Justin Jefferson was going to be missing some time. His teammate in KJ Osborne, who I do believe is going to be more of a risky start going forward. He's going to be some boomer bust. I think he could be a good flex option. Just depends on the matchup. Caught 5 out of 6 targets, just under 10 fantasy points. Still not seeing that production that we hope to see. I mean, out targeted, out receptions, out yards, and out touchdown. I mean, Jordan Addison has been doing that over KJ Osborne, I feel like, for the past 2 weeks since JJ has been gone. So a risky start for KJ Osborne. Now you go to the Green Bay Packers side of the ball. Christian Watson is still up in there. As I am recording this, we still don't know the severity of that injury. I mean, it looks like an ACL. It could be an MCL sprain. I do believe he is going to miss next week because it was like one of the last plays of this game against Denver where he did get injured. I don't expect him to play. If he does play, obviously you start him. But if he doesn't play, it kind of goes back into that possession of Romeo Doubs, right? Romeo, we saw that opportunity that he had without Christian Watson there when he missed the first 3 games of the season. Romeo Doubs did see all that opportunity, right? Week 3 caught 5 out of 12 targets and a touchdown, over 18 fantasy points. Week 4, 9 out of 13, 18 fantasy points. And then you see a little bit up and down. But as Christian Watson is out, a little bit more consistency for Romeo Doubs. So he is going to be a must start in my eyes, and a risky start for his teammate in Jaden Reed if Christian Watson is out. And if Christian Watson is in, I don't believe he is a suitable starter when all 3 of those guys are on the field. All right, our 5th matchup, only 5 matchups in here. Saints at the Colts. Over under, Colts are favored 42.5 here. Colts did get robbed off that Browns game. I would agree with a lot of Colts fans. I am sorry for that. Chris Olave, though, is a must start going forward. Scored over 12 fantasy points, 15 targets. Derek Carr, Chris Olave, still not on the same page, still struggling significantly. But look, he is getting the opportunities, he is getting the targets. Now, I know the biggest thing as I am recording this news kind of just broke, I would say 10 minutes before I'm recording this, that Chris Olave did get arrested for reckless driving. Essentially, I do believe he will play unless the league suspends him for some reason. So if that does change, I think that kind of affects everyone else down the road, like a Michael Thomas and Rashid Rice. So in this hypothetical, he does play. You start Chris Olave with confidence. Michael Thomas, look, still a mid wide receiver, a good flex option if you need a flex option, if you're struggling with injuries, if you don't have a good lineup, if you need a good 10 fantasy points. Michael Thomas has been consistent. Only 2 games he scored less than 10 fantasy points. Literally scored 9.3 and then 9.5. So you're going to get a good decent amount of points in that flex position if you need someone like a Michael Thomas. He is going against the Indianapolis Colts, who is a middle of the pack defense, so keep that in mind. Rashid Shaheed, still not somebody I'm willing to start, but if you do need a high upside, any game, Derek Carr has thrown the ball. I feel like all of his targets has been a deep pass down the field, 20 plus yards or more. It feels like it is for Rashid Shaheed. He is a risky start, but in reality, a must sit going down the road. I think if you are in a 14, 16 man league, risky start, and anything from an 8, 10 to 12, he is a must sit. Going to the Colts side of the ball, Zach has been saying this all season so far. Where does Michael Pittman get his production? Literally in the 4th quarter, in the second half of the game, essentially, where, literally the 2 passes that he caught was in the 4th quarter and literally one of the last drives of the game. And one of those plays, he breaks it out for an 83 or 74 yard touchdown where saves his day, scores over 16 fantasy points. Look, you start him, but just understand, don't be surprised if he gets you under 10 fantasy points and you're saying, what the hell happened to Michael Pittman? what's the context there, right? Going to his teammate Josh Downs, he has been more consistent, more available for Gardner Minshew. He is Gardner Minshew's first read when you really think about this. Caught 5 out of 6 and a touchdown, over 125 fantasy points. He does break away for that touchdown. What does his day look like without it? I still believe he still gets over 10 to 12 fantasy points with those opportunities. So he's still a good flex option, a very low end wide receiver, not low end wide receiver 2, but I would say a mid end wide receiver 3 if you are in a deeper league. But somebody I do believe is a must start going forward, especially against New Orleans Saints, where they're going to need to score. As bad as the Saints has been, they have a good defense, so I think they're going to have to try and score and get him a lot of opportunity. So Michael Pittman and Josh Downs are both must-starts going forward for me. All right, our sixth matchup of this week, Patriots at the Dolphins, a divisional game, 47.5. The Dolphins are favored. The largest over-under of the week, which is also very surprising. I guess the Dolphins, they have been consistently scoring, if I'm not mistaken, 25-plus points a game. And the Patriots, even though they had a couple goose eggs, they're still up there in the points per game, so keep that in mind. Starting at the Patriots side of the ball, Kendrick Bourne has been a very up and down player. Week 1 against Philly, 24 points, and then he has under 10 fantasy points from weeks 2 to 5, and then 2 back-to-back games against Vegas, against Buffalo, over 16 fantasy points. You see the targets, he's getting there. Can it be consistent? I'm not necessarily sure. The Dolphins do give up the 7th most fantasy points to the wide receiver position, so I am deeming him a risky start. If you are in a 16-man league, I'm happy to start him, or a bigger league, I understand. But a 10, 12, or 8, I'm more on the must-sit side. His teammate, Demario Douglas, we finally see that double-digit game. One of his second highest targets this year as well, caught 4 out of 6, 54 yards and 11 fantasy points. He is right now a must sit, but somebody that I wanted to mention as maybe a stash player that you can pick up and stash and say, hey, if he continues to grow, Mac Jones continues to get his connection with Demario Douglas, that is something that I think you should keep in mind. And obviously on the Dolphins side of the ball, let's not question it, let's not overthink it. Jalen Waddle, you start with confidence. He's getting better and better. Caught 6 out of 6, over 12 fantasy points this past week. Tyreek Hill, he's gonna do his thing. Even it kind of felt like it was a little bit underwhelming for the Dolphins, but Tyreek Hill, he still scored over 25 fantasy points. Wide receiver 1, somebody that you have loved to draft. I mean, he had one game. He has 0 games under double-digit points. His worst game has been in week 4 against the Buffalo Bills, where he scored 10 points. And you were like, what the hell, Tyreek? What is going on? Every other week you have been cheering 44, 30, 32, 28, 25. You start Tyreek Hill with confidence. Our 7th matchup of the week, Jets at the Giants, the Battle of New York. We'll see what happens here. My beloved New York Football Giants, the over-under is 36.5. The Jets are favored. And starting at the Jets side of the ball, really it's just Garrett Wilson. The only person I really want to start on this offense. I'm not going to be starting, an Allen Lazard or Randall Cobb. I'm not starting any of those guys. It is Garrett Wilson that you're confident in starting. In reality, he has been kind of performing and doing the thing that you hope that he does. Now the ceiling is not there as we expected with Zach Wilson. We were hoping for a higher ceiling with Aaron Rodgers, but you get you start what you have, right? 17 fantasy points against Philly this past week, called 8 out of 12 targets. Now, Philly is secondary, surprisingly, is worse than the Giants. The Giants currently give up the 11th most fantasy points to the wide receiver position, and I think they are finding their stride. Personally, as a Giants fan, I'm a little bit biased, but I'm not saying that you shouldn't start Garrett Wilson. He is a must start. Anything can happen, so you start him with confidence without a doubt. Going on the Giants side of the ball, there's no one really that you can start with confidence outside of Wan'Dale Robinson, and even then, he is a risky start. I have him as a risky start. These past 3 weeks, he comes back from that ACL tear from last year. San Francisco, 5 5 targets, Seattle 6 targets, Miami 6 targets, and then Buffalo 8 targets over 14 fantasy points. You saw the improvement in production. And then he goes to 2 targets this past week against Washington. I do believe game script has a lot to do with it, but if the Jets can score, that means that they're going to have to throw the ball just like we saw against Buffalo, we saw against Miami, we saw against Seattle. And if Daniel Jones does come back with his offensive line, Wan'Dale Robinson can see significant amount of work in the air specifically. So I'm not starting him with confidence. He's a risky start. I understand if you have to start him in a 14, 16-man league, as a flex option, I will do that, but in an 8, 10, or 12, he's more of a must sit until he comes back and shows us that he can be a viable starter. All right, our 8th matchup of this week, Jaguars at the Steelers. Over under is 41.5, and the Jags are favored coming into this week. And let's start the Jags side of the ball. A lot of people are very disappointed about Calvin Ridley. Only caught 1 out of 4 targets this past week against the New Orleans Saints, 1.5 fantasy points. A lot of people were upset, and I'm not really sure what to tell you. I've started him in multiple leagues with confidence, redraft, dynasty. Zach started in multiple leagues with confidence and redraft and dynasty. It looks like moving forward, he's going to be boom or bust. Now, specifically to the New Orleans games, there were so many opportunities where he was open. I do believe there is a little bit of a disconnect with Trevor Lawrence and throwing the deep ball. I think they're maybe utilizing Calvin Ridley in the wrong way because they already have their slot wide receiver in Christian Kirk, and you see those opportunities with Christian Kirk, right? But still, Calvin Ridley is this caliber of a player that you can't sit. I think we can have conversations on who you can start and sit versus Calvin Ridley. Please put it down in the comments below. I can definitely help you out, but I know the majority of the time, unless they are probably a top 15 wide receiver, we're probably going to tell you to start Calvin Ridley. But I understand if you are questioning, the Steelers do give up the 2nd most fantasy points to the wide receiver position. So this could be a phenomenal game coming in. So keep that in mind. His teammate, as I mentioned, Christian Kirk, has been phenomenal throughout the season. Only scored one game in this year where he only scored less, one digit game. What am I trying to say? One game where he scored less than double digits, okay? English is hard. That was week 1 against the Indianapolis Colts. Ever since then, from week 2, he has scored over 13 fantasy points or more. Christian Kirk has been consistent. This is something I was saying going into the draft process. A lot of people were drafting Calvin Ridley at the end of the 2nd, early 3rd, and I was saying you can get Christian Kirk 3 rounds later. He's more consistent. I do believe this is going to help. Now his other teammate in Zay Jones, I think a lot of people are saying this is affecting Christian Kirk. While this is why he has been doing so great, but if he's out of the game, I'm starting Christian Kirk with confidence until Zay Jones comes back and proves us wrong. So we'll wait and see if he does practice this week coming in to week 8. Going to the Steelers side of the board, George Pickens, you start him with confidence. I mean, caught 5 out of 8, 15 fantasy points. He is getting those deep ball passes, those chunk plays, those chunk yardage, which is exactly what you want to see. The Jags currently give up the 8th most fantasy points to the wide receiver position. And hey, they give up chunk plays. We've seen it, right? We've seen those opportunities, so keep that in mind. And his teammate that just came back, Deontay Johnson, caught 5 out of 6 targets, 12 fantasy points, only 66% of the snap share. That is going to progress. That's going to increase, especially, in my opinion, coming into next week. He's going to see more of an opportunity against the Jacksonville Jaguars. Once again, give up the 8th most fantasy points to the wide receiver position, so keep that in mind going into week 8. Okay, our next matchup here, Falcons at the Titans. Over under 37, starting at the Falcons side of the ball. You start Drizzy Drake Rogers. I mean, ever since that dud week in week 1, he has been great, has been consistent. You know, over 10 fantasy points every single week, actually outside of week 3 against Detroit. But other than that, 11, 14, 21, 11 fantasy points, 18 fantasy points. He has been there. He has been a good mid-wide receiver currently, but has been disappointing. And I think that's exactly what you want to see. And they've been improving. He's been improving in his targets, in his reception, in his yardage every single week. Obviously, it's up and down, but you start him with confidence here, especially against the Tennessee Titans, who early in the season were giving up a lot of points to the wide receiver position. They did have a bye week, so that definitely does skew it. I don't think this offense gets any better, or defense, against any better. Kevin Bird just gets traded. Bird by ride, however way you say, just gets traded to the Philadelphia Eagles. So that also is a clear indication that they're just going to fire sell. They're just going to put all these rookies, these players that are going to make a lot of mistakes. Drake London could be a benefactor of that. Going to the Tennessee Titans side of the ball, DeAndre Hopkins is a risky start because who the hell is going to be the quarterback? Is it going to be Malik? Ryan Tannehill, we know, is going to miss multiple weeks. Is it going to be Malik? Is it going to be Will Levis? We're going to see a fluctuation of quarterbacks at the Tennessee Titan position. So he is a risky start. I don't want to start him whatsoever, but I understand if you have to start him in your leagues. Comment down below who you're starting DeAndre Hopkins over. If you do have, maybe we can have a conversation. So hopefully that helps. Those are the guys I'm going to be starting going into week 8 in this matchup. All right, going into our next matchup here, Eagles at the Commanders. Divisional game, over under is 45. The Eagles are clearly favored. AJ Brown, you start. I mean, he has been great so far. Wide receiver 3 on the season. Now, the biggest question mark is Devonta Smith. I do believe he's going to get better. Zach believes he's going to get better. I mean, you've seen like the opportunities and how he has been a boom a boom player when he's on the field, but he's just not getting the opportunity ever since AJ Brown had that little cry. Now, Washington does give up the 5th most fantasy points to the wide receiver position, and we saw the Eagles did struggle. Right, we've also seen that the Commanders have been the Eagles' kryptonite in the past as well. So look, the last time Devonta Smith played the Eagles, caught 7 out of 9 targets, over 14 fantasy points. I think we can see something similar and hopefully better. I'm still starting Devonta Smith coming into this week. Going to the Commander side of the ball, the only 2 confident players I'm confident in starting is Terry McLaurin, who just had 15 fantasy points against the Giants, and then Curtis Samuel. Now, Curtis Samuel is the one that I think a lot of people are saying, well, should I start him? He just had a bad week. I mean, it's clearly he's going to have these boom bust games, but I feel like he has been the best player for the favorite, player for Sam Howell. So you're going to be starting Curtis Samuel with confidence. I don't see a place and a point why you should be starting Curtis Samuel. I'm starting Curtis Samuel over Jahan Dotson if I had him, and maybe some other players if you comment down below. So once again, Terry, you start. Curtis Samuel, you start. Jahan Dotson, you sit, because the Eagles do give up the 3rd most fantasy points to the wide receiver position. All right, the start of the afternoon slate games. Browns at the Seattle Seahawks, 40.5. The Seahawks are favored, obviously, with Deshaun Watson down currently day to day. We're going to get the more information as I'm recording this. They're waiting on the MRI. I don't believe he's going to play coming into this week, but I do believe Amari Cooper is still somebody worth starting. I mean, we've seen the targets that he's getting. It may not be the same connection, but if they do connect in those deep passes opportunities with PJ Walker, Amari Cooper is going to benefit after that, right? Week 6 against the 49ers, caught 4 out of 8 over 13 fantasy points. You were happy with that with PJ Walker. This past week against the Indianapolis Colts, caught 2 out of 8 for 4 fantasy points. It's going to get better. You hope and believe. The Seattle Seahawks do give up the 4th most fantasy points to the wide receiver position, and I do believe, PJ Walker could have a game if he is going to start. His teammate, the guy that I love, and Elijah Moore, technically does better than Amari Cooper, catches 4 out of 7, still getting the targets. It's just with PJ Walker. I'm not necessarily sure when this opportunity is going to arise for Elijah Moore. I hope it's this week. I was wishing it was 3-4 weeks ago, but he is a must-sit coming into this week. Going to the Seahawks side of the ball, let's start off with Jackson Smith and Jigba. He had his career game this year, caught 4 out of 7 targets, only 63% of the snap share, and a touchdown, right? Scoring over 16 fantasy points. Now, the biggest caveat here, do you start him? I do have him as a spot start right now, depending on your leagues, depending on who else you have. I will say this. I'm a little bit skeptical, not only because, this is quote unquote an asterisk. I want to give JSN his flowers, but we have to see what it looks like when DK does come back. Do they bring, do they put him on the field less with DK Metcalf? Does he get targeted less? Even though he was progressing week in and week out, if DK is healthy, you have to imagine that DK is going to get those opportunities. Is going to be in those 2 wide receiver sets with Tyler Lockett and DK Metcalf over Jackson Smith and Jigba. So we'll wait and see on that. I do have him as a spot star, but if DK starts, you start DK and start Tyler Lockett, and you have Jason as a spot start. But if DK doesn't start, obviously you start Tyler Lockett as a must start and a JSN as a must start coming into this game. I know the Browns give up the least amount of fantasy points, or excuse me, the third least amount of fantasy points to the wide receiver position, but you saw what the coach just did to the Browns. Anything can happen based off matchup. Our 12th matchup of this week, Ravens at the Cardinals, over under 44. Ravens are favored. Clearly, they just dominated the Detroit Lions. No one was expecting that type of game. You start Zay Flowers, who has been consistent outside of one game where he scored over 10 fantasy points in every single game besides week 4 against the Cleveland Browns, who give up the least amount of fantasy points, excuse me, the third least now amount of fantasy points to the wide receiver position. At the time, they gave up the least. So you start Zay Flowers. You're not starting OBJ. You're not starting, Rashad Bateman, even though he had a better game. You're not starting Nelson Aguilar. I'm not starting any of those guys. Only Zay Flowers. Now on the Cardinal side of the ball, you start Hollywood Brown, even though he did have a shaking last 2 weeks, scoring less than 8 fantasy points in week 6 and a week 7 against the Seattle Seahawks. But you have to believe that it's going to get better. This could be the week as well that Kyler Murray does start. So if Kyler Murray does start, I know you're going to start him with confidence, but if Josh Dobbs does start as well, you still have to start him with confidence. He's been great so far. Wide receiver 20. Literally, these past 2 weeks has been his worst weeks this year so far. You hope and expect the bounce back to come back. I know for a lot of Michael Wilson believers, it just still hasn't been the time. I'm not necessarily sure if I'm going to be starting him unless Kyler Murray's in, unless I'm in a deeper league, a 16, a 14, an even bigger league. So Michael Wilson is a must-sit moving forward for me. All right, Chiefs at the Broncos coming into this week, our 13th matchup this week. Clearly, the Chiefs are favored. We saw this matchup a couple weeks ago already on Thursday Night Football. The Chiefs are clearly favored into this game, and the only wide receiver I'm confident starting who has been consistent almost every single game since week 5 has been Richie Rich. Week 5, 13 fantasy points. Week 6, 11 fantasy points. Week 7, 17 fantasy points. Caught 5 out of 6 targets and 60 yards and a touchdown. His highest snap percentages so far this season with 59% of the snaps. Can we just get him to be on the field 100%? Can we just say this is I don't want to say he's the Tyreek Hill, but can we just say he's just going to be on the field? Give him 80% of the snap share. Let Mahomes continue to cook him. Why are they like slow playing this? Why are they having these rotations at wide receiver? Kadarius Toney is not the guy because I hate him. I'm a biased Giants fan. Who knows? Sky Moore, I do believe he could be the guy, but clearly he's not the guy for Patrick Mahomes. It's Rashee Rice. Give him more opportunity. I don't understand why they're slow milking it, they're slow balling it. Start Rashee Rice. I do believe he is a good start as a flex option. He's been consistent the last 3 weeks, and you can think that's going to continue against the Denver Broncos, which we saw. He had a good game against the Denver Broncos, caught 4 out of 4, 72 yards, over 11 fantasy points in week 6. I do believe he can have a game like that similar. So we'll wait and see as well. Going to the Broncos side of the ball, really the only person I'm excited to start is Courtland Sutton. He's the one that has been the most consistent. He's been scoring touchdowns. He has scored touchdowns in 2, 4, 5 out of the last 7 games so far. He has been the best wide receiver on this offense. He's been the most targeted wide receiver on this offense as well. So if there's anyone that I'm going to start as a low-end wide receiver 2, is going to be Courtland Sutton. Now going to his teammate and Jerry Jeudy, this could be the week where he gets traded. Even though he had a double-digit game against the Green Bay Packers, I'm still not confident in starting him. I'm not necessarily sure what's going to happen with Jerry Jeudy. It's been very disappointing. He is a risky start coming in, and I'm not starting Marvin Mims. So I don't expect Jerry Jeudy to have the best game. We saw what he did against KC, week 6, called 3 out of 5 and 4 targets. No, thank you. He's a risky start. He's really more of a must-sit in an 8, 10 to 12, and a risky start in any bigger leagues. All right, our next match, we got 2 or 3 more matchups left. Bengals at the 49ers. 49ers are favored into this game. They did lose against the Minnesota Vikings in that upset on Monday Night Football, but you expect them to bounce back. Going to the Bengals side of the ball, you start Jamar Chase, you start T. Higgins if he starts, and you're not starting Tyler Boyd, okay? T. Higgins, I know a lot of people are questioning, but he is going to get better. He is going to do be better. So do not expect that to change anything either. You saw Jordan Addison eat. You saw KJ Osborne have these big chunk plays. T. Higgins, Joe Burrow, and Jamar Chase are clearly a better offense. These guys can eat against the San Francisco 49ers. And the 49ers side of the ball, you start Brandon Ayuk over 10 fantasy points this past week. And Deebo Samuel if he plays. Obviously, it was clearly shown how vital Deebo was to this offense and is to this offense. And if he plays, you start him. That's all I have to say. So that is a pretty easy matchup coming into this week. All right, going into our Sunday night matchup, Bears at the Chargers. We'll wait and see what happens with Justin Fields. Very unlikely that he does play, but look, right now the Chargers are heavily favored, 45.5 in this game. We saw the Bears really upset the Las Vegas Raiders. It wasn't really an upset. I'm not necessarily sure. I think it could have gone either way. But look, DJ Moore coming onto the Bears side of the ball, caught 8 out of 9 targets, over 13 fantasy points, had that touchdown get called back. He did step out of bounds. If he doesn't step out of bounds, that is a big week. Not big week for him, an extra 6 points. Was that 19 fantasy points for him? That would have been a whole different story with DJ Moore. So look, I think he's a must start coming in, even with Tyson Baguette, I like to call him, against the Los Angeles Chargers, who currently give up the most fantasy points to the wide receiver position. So I would like to think that DJ Moore, not that I would like to think, he is a must start coming in to week 8. And his Darnell Mooney, I am not starting. Keenan Allen on the other side of the ball, he's a must start, obviously. And then Josh Palmer, who we saw go 5 out of 7, 133 yards, over 18 fantasy points. That's going to continue coming into this week. The Bears currently give the 13 most fantasy points to the wide receiver position. So that's where I'm going with these guys. And Quentin Johnson, you just can't start until we see more progression with him. All right, and our Monday night matchup, the last matchup of this week, Raiders at the Lions. Lions are favored 44.5 here. Starting at the Raiders side of the ball, you start Devonta Smith, catching 7 out of 12 targets this past week, over 12 fantasy points, 75% of the snap share. He does leave the game because they were essentially getting blown out, and like I would say midway through the fourth quarter. But you do start Devontae Adams. He's clearly upset, and you have to expect this team to be better against the Lions secondary, who currently give the 10th most fantasy points to the wide receiver position. Jacoby Myers still doing his thing, caught 7 out of 13 targets and a touchdown. No matter who the quarterback is, Jimmy O'Connell or Brian Hoyer, we've seen it. So you start Jacoby Myers, wide receiver 12 currently on the season. So you start him with confidence. Going to the Lions side of the ball, Amon-Ra St. Brown genuinely is really the only wide receiver I'm excited to start on this team. I'm not starting a Josh Reynolds. And honestly, right now, Jameson Williams, I am not starting. He's having these boom or bust games. He was targeted 6 times where there was a multiple opportunities where he was able to catch the ball. It was a blowout where you expect him to catch that pass. But he went from 13 fantasy points, we're only catching 2 out of 3 in the touchdown because he caught that touchdown, to not catching a ball with 6 targets and dropping a goose egg. So I think it can happen this week against the Raiders, where he catches that big bomb pass. But, how desperate are you? How big is your league? But 8, 10, 12, I would say even 14-man league, I'm not necessarily sure I'm starting Jameson Williams. So he is a must-sit coming into week 8 of the fantasy football season. Guys, that is over 16 matchups, over 60 wide receivers. Hopefully, I spoke about almost any or all of your wide receivers that are currently rostered on your team. If you have any questions, comments, or concerns, please comment down below with anything that you have. We're going to be answering every single comment as we do for every video. And before I let you go, flockfantasy.com/land, the best place to support what Zach and I are doing here. If you want to see Zach's must-start list for almost literally every single position, quarterback, wide receiver, tight end, defenses, and so much more, all you have to do is sign up at flockfantasy.com/land. Use our promo code LAND, and we can get you 30% off at sign up, guys. Hopefully this is helpful. Hopefully you get a win going into week 8. And we'll see you on our live streams at 8 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. As always, it's all love.
Now that those idiots are done talking, who needs some rankings?
Hell yeah, I need some rankings.
Then use promo code LAND, L-A-N-D, for 30% off any membership at flockfantasy.com.
Oh.
It's so easy. Even your grandma could scan that QR code right there.